My name is Jake Galdo, and I'm pleased to be here today to participate in our third general session of the 2020 PQA Annual Meeting. The inspiration for today's conversation is You're Not Listening by Kate Murphy. It's a book about how we should be better listening to each other, and it made us at PQA reflect on how we can better listen to our patients in their journeys through healthcare. And through that, we have invited two thought leaders in patient engagement to help us learn more about this facet of healthcare. Our first thought leader is Suzanne Schrandt. She's a patient and a patient engagement engineer with a health and disability law and policy background. She's launched ExPPect as a way to bring into focus the need for greater patient engagement across the healthcare ecosystem. Suz, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you mind sharing with us your story and initial thoughts on patient engagement?
Sure. Thank you, Jake, and thanks so much to PQA for the invitation to be here. As you shared from my bio, Jake, I am very invested in the patient engagement space, and I've actually been fortunate to be sort of on the front edge of the patient engagement revolution. I come by that very honestly. This summer marks my 30th year, 3-0, of having a form of rheumatoid arthritis that affects children. I was diagnosed sort of as a teenager, and really right from the beginning, this disease has been pretty tough. I had my first joint replacements when I was 25. I had my knees done. Since then, I've had both of my wrists done. I'm currently shopping for shoulders, and I'll have many other interventions if I'm fortunate to live a long life. But having this disease in this particular time frame actually afforded me a front row seat to one of the most sort of amazing time periods in pharmaceutical development. So when I was diagnosed in 1990, the standard therapy was high doses of NSAIDs and high doses of oral steroids, both of which I took, and I had the moon face to show it. Fast forward just a few years, we emerged into the cocktail era, which is not as much fun as it seems. That was a DMARD cocktail. So chemotherapeutic drugs, transplant anti-rejection drugs, along with those NSAIDs and high-dose steroids. And you would take 5 or 6 of these at the same time. So my body was sort of a veritable carnival of side effects. I mean, it was whack-a-mole. And then you fast forward a few more years and we enter the biologic era, and I really cannot overstate the dramatic impact that had on my community. I've taken just about every infusible and injectable from TNF alphas to IL-6 and anything in between. And then just over about a year ago, I started my first oral small molecule JAK inhibitor therapy. So that was the first time in 19 years I wasn't being infused or giving myself injections. So I'm kind of the planes, trains, and automobiles of medication use. I've seen it all. Now, how does that transfer and become relevant to our topic today, to patient engagement and PQA's work and in this field in general? You know, it turns out living all those years with those experiences gives you a whole bunch of insight. And I speak for our entire community of patients. Anyone who's lived those experiences has a lot to offer, especially when you think about pharmacists, clinicians, researchers working to measure quality and think about safe and effective use of medicines. I will say my experience in patient engagement isn't only in this space, it really kind of spans every facet of healthcare and research. My first job in patient engagement was as a about 18-year-old, maybe 19, serving as a patient faculty member in a medical school. I was teaching first-year medical students how to discern signs and symptoms of inflammatory arthropathies using my diseased joints and my firsthand accounts as sort of a living textbook. But the skills and the ethos for any type of patient engagement is the same. It's transferable. It doesn't matter what space you occupy in healthcare or in research, it's the same. And that ethos is you cannot build a product or create a service or attempt to develop a measure that is responsive to what patients need and want. if you don't ask patients what they need and want, and don't partner with them to co-create it and make sure that you get it right.
Thank you, Suze. Thank you so much for sharing your story and helping us see the impact that being a patient has had, not just on your life, but your professional career as well, as a way to really engage others. And it's very humbling and amazing to hear that your first job was 18 at a medical school teaching medical students how to be better clinicians. And so I think that this is a great way to include our other colleague in our conversation today. So I'd like to introduce Katherine Capperella. Katherine is the Global Head of Patient Engagement Leader at Janssen. And what's really exciting is we just heard, Suze, about why this is so important. And so I want to pivot a little bit and talk to Katherine as a PQA member and say, what does this mean to you? And how do you, with your organization, really focus in on patient engagement?
Hi, guys. Happy Friday. I couldn't agree with you guys more. At Janssen, we're part of Johnson & Johnson. So patients come first in our credo, which is much more than a piece of paper. It's really a way of life in our organization. However, I was brought into the role I have now approximately 4 years ago because we needed to change the way we work from doing things for patients to doing things with patients. And so we have mapped out points in time where we expect patients to have a seat at the table. And those things include understanding lived experiences so we can better meet unmet needs. They also include measuring what matters to patients. They also include involving patients in product formulation and design. And we talked about that earlier. We have a way to go there. And then involving patients in clinical trials. Are we designing a clinical trial that makes sense? And are the elements of that trial the best they can be for the patient experience so that when people volunteer their time and lives to sign up for a trial, they're able to stick with it. So we've really, over the last years, been measuring our progress. I'm happy about the way things have changed, but I feel like we still have a way to go. I think, the benefit is that our culture is very patient-centric, and we have to marry that up with continuing to change the way we work.
Awesome. Thank you, Katherine. So Suze, kind of piggybacking off of what Katherine was just saying, she says, we have a way to go. So why is patient engagement important, specifically within the confines of healthcare quality?
Yeah, so, quality is a pretty unique space, and I will way oversimplify this, but in the quality space, we're not building a new product. We're not seeking to sort of quantify what the problems are. We're really pausing and asking, is what we're doing working, and is it working well? And so the patient engagement sort of lens there is, well, working well for whom? Working well to contain costs, or working well for a hospital or a clinician? What we really want to know is it working well for patients? And only patients have that unique context to be able to report and share whether something is working well. We can get pretty far afield from what's important to patient outcomes if we aren't involving patients in that way. And I think we've seen some fails in this area across all of the healthcare ecosystem. The one I always pick on, and apologies if anyone was involved in these, but the Hcap score. So this is the assessment of quality of care in a hospital setting. If you're inpatient, you get an Hcap survey to fill out. I happen to have experienced a pretty significant medical error during my long tenure as a patient. I had a 5-day inpatient stay after my left wrist replacement, came pretty close to losing my hand, and still have some permanent nerve damage. It was all from a preventable medical error. When I filled out my Hcap score, there was no place to say, by the way, this whole visit was preventable. By the way, I'm leaving with permanent damage. I'm worse now than I was when I came in. And so even though my outcomes were very poor, that hospital got a high score because the food was good and the room was comfortable and people were very cheerful and friendly. So to me, it's a big miss when we're having an outcome score that so ineffectively captures what patients care about. And I think it's almost an oxymoron to think that you can work in healthcare quality and attempt to measure quality without talking to patients. It's kind of it's jumbo shrimp. You have to talk to patients in order to know whether that healthcare was high quality.
I agree. I think in drug development, it's the same thing. I think we all want the same thing, and that's to improve patient outcomes. And so if there isn't a patient informing the decisions that are made, then we're really missing an opportunity, whether it's, measuring what matters to patients. And, you look sometimes at patient reported outcomes and the tools are validated, but maybe they're not necessarily measuring what matters to patients. And I think we as an industry have seen some really nice examples where people are bold enough to develop new tools that actually measure what matters to patients. And when that happens, it's much better information and it's much more relevant to patient outcomes.
That's awesome. And I really like where this conversation is going. And one aspect, Katherine, that you just touched upon is this idea of drug development. And earlier, as we were in our green room getting ready for this conversation, Suze, you were actually talking about a specific example within drug development from your perspective. Do you mind kind of sharing that with us so we can kind of take a deeper dive into it?
Oh, absolutely, sure. This is a sort of a mode of administration issue with drug development, but something that's been hailed quite a bit is the idea of auto injectors for people with diseases like mine, where your hands are one of the first, usually the first things to get involved. It can become really hard to use a very small syringe like what you would use for insulin. And so based on that understanding that these are very difficult to use and you have to draw the medication out and then inject it, these auto injectors came to pass, which again, I think it's a great step. It's certainly, I've used them. It's certainly easier to put your hand around, but the very same functional issue that necessitates the use of an auto injector is the reason it's really hard to pinch. You get all sorts of issues with hyperextension and flexion of the thumb. And when you're going to do opposition to pinch yourself, it either hurts quite a bit or you can't do it. And so when you are sitting there and holding that auto injector for the requisite 5 or 10 seconds, you might lose your pinch. And all of a sudden you've given yourself an IM injection instead of sub-Q. You get a big welt. You don't know if it's being metabolized the right way. So it always kind of strikes me as it's so close. If there had actually been patients in the room talking about that entire experience of care and medication use, could we have ended up with some newfangled auto injector that has like a pincher or a clamp, which sounds far-fetched, but I think it would be fantastic. So anyone listening who can create that, let's do that.
I'm listening. I mean, it just goes to show, like, we get together for a conference like this and the ideas are already flowing. Yeah. And, we had an example like that. We have a product that is dosed, it's an intranasal device. And in the clinical trials, there were approximately 200 complaints per month. So we brought patients into the equation and sat down with patients and made 2 simple changes to the device. One was a window that showed green and red. It was green when the proper dose had been administered. And then it was a platform that showed the depth of insertion. And those 2 things reduced the product complaints from 200 a month to 2 per month. And when you think about that, there's probably also the assumption that people are getting the correct dosing, which is going to improve the clinical trial results and the data collected. And reducing those complaints could fast forward into the real world, because if we had launched our product into a world and gotten all those complaints afterwards, rather than making those changes before the product was on the market, it really would have been an unsuccessful launch. And in this case, by involving patients earlier, I think we had a better product, and it's probably good for our company as well.
That's right.
That's amazing. And that's really exciting. And it really shows the impact of integrating our patients into every facet of what we do. You both have made really strong cases for this integration in healthcare, from development to evaluation to quality measures. Last year, PQA completed work on a patient engagement rubric to help us evaluate patient engagement in quality measure development. This work, by the way, was modeled after the PQA engagement rubric, which Suze co-authored, so I have to give her a big shout out and thank you for that, because it was an inspiration for us. So starting with Suze, can you help us understand, now that we've started talking about all these reasons why we should integrate patients, into potential solutions to better increase that engagement?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, congratulations on your rubric. That's exciting. And I'm so glad the PCORI rubric was a good resource for you. I think to sort of either increase the use within an organization or to get more people and more organizations to embrace the concepts and ethos of patient engagement, we really have to be able to prove that the value is real, that there is true value, however you want to define that. And unfortunately, it's really easy, and it's unfortunately really common to just throw patients in a room and call it patient engagement, and then be underwhelmed by what you got because it wasn't carefully curated, it wasn't thought about, it was just, we'll invite 3 patients and allow them to speak for 2 seconds at the beginning of the agenda. It reminds me of, I'm sure you all saw those photos from the Southwest flight I think it was several months ago now. Something happened in the plane, the oxygen masks fell from the ceiling, and the internet was full of photos of people wearing the masks like this instead of like this. We can't blame that on the mask, right? That is an application failure. And that application piece is so important in patient engagement. And so I guess my guidance, if I could pick one thing, is you cannot dabble in patient engagement. So you need to go deep, do it in a rigorous methodological way. If you feel like that's too big of a step to take, do a pilot. Take a little bit of work and go deep in that little bit of work until you can feel comfortable with what you're doing and kind of replicate. You mentioned the PCORI rubric. You can go to the PCORI website now and see case after case after case of examples of the value of this. And now in drug development, Ken Getz out of Tufts and Bennett Levitan have produced this paper on the actual financial, there's numerical value of patient engagement in drug development. So it starts to become the why not, why wouldn't you do this? But I think if we all can, as a community, continue to do what we're doing really well, and then publicize the heck out of our wins, that's how we spread this. That's what I believe.
We are in the camp of why wouldn't we do this? And I think a lot of pharmaceutical companies, and I would argue most, feel the same way. And I think PQA feels the same way. I think that when you believe that it's adding value, then you have to put in tools, processes, measurement, training. All of those things are going to help us make patient engagement more systematic. So we have mapped out 7 points in time where we would expect patients to be involved, starting at discovery, going through post-marketing. We've created new tools and processes. We have a new target product profile. It's not so new anymore. We put a whole program in place called the Patient Voice and Clinical Trial Program, where there's a person, there's a budget, it happens routinely. And through some of those approaches, we also have a patient engagement playbook, and we have what we put in place called the patient engagement dashboard, which was our way of measuring the behavior that we expected our teams to do. And so I think when you kind of take a systematic approach and say, what are we looking for? When do we expect it to happen? And then measure whether or not it's happening, then you start to see the change. And when you see the change, you really realize the benefits. It's wonderful that there's the article about the value, and it's wonderful all the other places you can go for value, but you can't really experience the full value until you experience the engagements directly.
I think that's really exciting. And I almost want to spend the entire moment, just like the rest of our conversation right here. From Suze, we're learning that we need to dig deep and really commit. Katherine, you're telling us to create a systematic way to really evaluate so we can continue to get better. And so I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit and tease out that systematic part. So at PQA, we often discuss medication use quality measures, and in the larger healthcare environment, we discuss meaningful measures, and often what is meaningful to patients. And this is actually something that we talked about earlier in today's conversation. So Suze, I'll let you kind of take this first, but can you help us understand what we should be measuring such that it is meaningful to patients?
Yeah, and you know, Jake, the fact that you and PQA are asking this question is the most important first step, right? Because for a long time, we substituted what clinicians or other healthcare professionals thought was meaningful as that was the proxy for what patients thought was meaningful. And thankfully, we've really moved past that. To me, I always go back to the word context. I think what patients can always provide is context. And really, again, oversimplifying, but sort of in two buckets. On the benefit side, so sort of anticipated benefit, what does benefit really look like? But then on the complexity of use. And when we're thinking about safety and effective use and doing it, you know, using them the right way, that's where a whole host of context lives. I think people can wrap their heads around the benefit side. Sure, patients would have something to say about how a therapy would benefit them and what they're hoping to achieve or get out of a benefit. What I've sort of experienced in my conversations across lots of domains is I get more surprised faces or aha moments when we talk about the complexity of use piece. Something as simple as this medication should be taken with food. Okay, is this a person with food security? Is this a person who has a job that allows them enough break time to have food if there's a multiple dosing regimen? If it's an injectable drug, does the person have the dexterity, the ability to inject that drug? One of the things that we deal with in the rheumatology community, and this is a fine drug, it's a safe drug, so I'm not bashing the drug, but there's a gold standard therapy we use in rheumatology. It's been around forever. It's very safe. It also very often causes nausea, vomiting, and just malaise. That is not considered a serious side effect. But guess what? If this is taking a couple days out of every one of your weeks, or you're a little kid and you're throwing up on the school bus, that quickly becomes the reason you're not taking this as prescribed. Only patients can sort of provide that context and that framing. So I understand the incredible complexity around, especially measures in the adherence space, but we have got to figure out a way to bring in the why. I think it would be far more edifying to understand why there's a lack of adherence instead of just quantifying that there is a lack of adherence. So we have to figure out better ways to bring that context in.
Awesome. Katherine, from your perspective, as you're building drugs and you want patients to take them, you want the drugs to work really well for those individuals, can you think about how maybe what you're doing really addresses this idea of what are we measuring meaningfully?
I agree with everything that Suze was saying. It's that the patient has to we have to incorporate patient perspectives into benefit risk. And what we really need to measure is why. As I think about the digital world and artificial intelligence and all the data that's going to tell us people stop taking their medicines, it's not telling us why.
I think that's awesome. So I want to kind of pivot yet again. And this one is a little personal to me, but I think it is helpful for us to put in this context. For this entire time, we've been discussing the patient and the patient's voice. And Suze and Katherine, you both actually talked about the context for the patient. So I want to take a moment and get your insights on another stakeholder, the caregiver. There are a variety of medical conditions, and personally, I always think about Alzheimer's disease, where the caregiver is a vital member to the successful care of that individual and the care that's being delivered. So how, not just do we overcome the barrier of engaging the patient, but how do we take it a step further and engage the caregiver in these stories, in these conversations?
I mean, you said it beautifully, Jake. They are indispensable members of the care team, and your framing was more adults caring for adults. My experience is more in the pediatric space, but just think about something as simple as the choice between an injectable therapy and an oral therapy. If you are the parent of a 5-year-old and this is a shot you're giving multiple times a week or even once a week, the impact that has on the family and the planning for that shot or those multiple shots versus something oral you could crush and put in applesauce or however it needs to be dispensed. These are really impactful decisions. They're not slight. And so we have to talk to the people who are actually in charge of those decisions. And so absolutely, I really should always say patients and caregivers. I've just shorthanded it.
Same boat. We, in our definition of patient engagement, we do include patient and caregivers. And certainly in diseases such as mental health, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, and many others, it's only the caregiver that can round out what life is really like and what the lived experiences are really like. And so you need that voice in order to develop solutions to really improve outcomes.
Perfect, thank you. I will say one of my major takeaways right now is to always dispense applesauce with medications, just to make sure that the children can get their meds. We do have a little bit of time for some Q&A, and so the one that is really big that's been kind of coming out that I think from the questions thematically is, how do you start? And so, Suze, I've always been picking on you going first, so I'm actually going to pivot and ask Katherine to start first, and then we'll go to Suze. How do you start this type of engagement?
We started by writing a definition that we could all align on. What do we mean by patient engagement? And there are 3 elements to the definition. It has to be systematic as opposed to ad hoc. It has to be early, and it has to be direct and not through a proxy. And once we said, this is what we mean in our company by patient engagement, then we said, okay, what behaviors are we looking for? When does it need to happen? And so in terms of making it systematic, we did build tools, we did build processes, we did begin measuring, because we felt that doing it that way was going to really jumpstart things. And so when we put our patient engagement dashboard in place, we couldn't measure every compound in the pipeline. What we did is we identified approximately 20 compounds that are the most valuable to the organization. And we measured whether or not patients were involved early and often in 7 steps in getting those medicines built. And because of that, we were able to really focus in on what was working well and where we needed to troubleshoot. So I think that putting those kinds of frameworks in place really helps in a big organization.
I mean, Katherine, you said the magic words, which are early and often. So the key to starting is starting upstream enough that it's not too late, because you don't want to pull patients in for sort of a tokenistic stamp of whatever you're working on. It really needs to be about a true partnership. One thing I think I would offer from the patient perspective is you really can treat it as a formal sort of agreement. When I was at the Arthritis Foundation, I worked on draft, MOUs or memorandum of understanding that you all sign. This isn't, this is a true partnership. That means I call it the shoulder shrug. We don't want patients giving shoulder shrug responses. We want them to have done their homework. And likewise, we want the company or whomever else is at the table doing their homework and being fair and equitable partners. And so I think you can, the first thing to do is really treat it like the formal partnership that it is, because that says a lot about the value you're placing on the relationship. That's what you would do with any other partner.
I agree with that, because it really is about a partnership, and it's having an equal seat at the table, which means it's a business agreement or it's a formal discussion, and we're going to map out what the rules of those engagements are so that it's fair, that there's respect. I mean, I think you guys, in addition to the PQA rubric, there's also a nice tool developed by PFMD, Patient Focused Medicines Development, and it has 7 points that map out quality engagements. And it starts with getting together at the very beginning to co-create an agenda, co-create expectations, and treat each other as equals.
I think that's amazing. Suze, Katherine, thank you so much for sharing your insights. This has been wonderful. I've gained a lot out of it, and it's helping me understand how to have some of these conversations in the care that gets delivered to our family unit. So I have a little bit of a cheesy last-minute question, if you will. There's a book by Vivek Murthy called Together, and in it, he describes a new project called the 3 Wishes Project. And the 3 Wishes Project is where someone dying in ICU gets 3 wishes as a way to pass peacefully and pass in a way that is meaningful to them. And so I want to use that as an idea because there's 3 of us. And so I'd like each of us to have one wish on what we would do to make patient engagement better. And Suze, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I think my wish is that we could look at patient engagement as an opportunity to gain instead of a need to give up. I think oftentimes the other stakeholders, so that anyone who isn't the patient, thinks they have to give something up, give up control, give up time, give up resource. And in actuality, it is, you're going to get what you put in back in spades. So I think it's sort of, why can't we all get along is my wish.
Perfect. Katherine?
Oh, so first of all, I want to say, Suze, I think there's a competitive advantage to engaging with patients. I think clinical trials can go quicker, which is an advantage for anybody, whether it's a patient waiting for a medicine or a company developing one.
Right.
And I think also that companies can differentiate when they really listen to patients. And I think there's a competitive advantage. But my wish is that a patient has a seat at every table. And that if I think about in, pharmaceutical development, if you're sitting around a conference table, real or virtual, and a patient isn't there, we shouldn't start. The patient should have a seat at the table, and that should be from the very beginning. That's my wish.
That's true. I love it. I love both of your wishes, and I'm really happy to say that my wish isn't the same. I was concerned that we were going to have same wishes, but they're all unique. So my wish is for us to have better empathy, which goes back to the context. It goes back to, Suze, you teaching medical students. And my very brief example of that is when we talked about caregivers. My perspective was adult to adult. And you said, Jake, what about adult to child? And blew my mind, right? And so it's that empathy to fully understand everyone and the journeys that they go through with the care that they are receiving and the medical condition burden that they might be overcoming, honestly. So again, Katherine, Suze, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And now I'd like to transition to another note from our sponsors.